Good afternoon. This is a YouTube video called The Firing Line with William F. Buckley Jr. This was his show. William F. Buckley was a political journalist. This panel consists of 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. William F. Buckley Jr., Mark Green, Harriet Pilpel, and Joe Sobran. On this edition of Firing Line, William F. Buckley is opening himself up to questions and for questioning. And I'm just going to go straight into the question posed by Harriet Pilpel with regard to abortion. This edition of Firing Line aired, I believe it was live. It says it's recorded. Episode SO 485, recorded on November 12th, 1981. This was after Roe versus Wade. And I just want you to, if you're interested, listen to this conversation. It's interesting that the 2 Edomites, Mark Green and Harriet Pilpel, are flanked by 2 of the children of Jacob Israel, William F. Buckley Jr., who you see here in this picture, and also Joseph Sobran, who will enter into the conversation. So let me just start the video now.
I'm going to 7% to 8%.
Well, I don't want to take up any more time on that because I want to go to my own questions. When you last, as far as I know, discussed the question of abortion, you came out in favor of a statute now pending in Congress, introduced into the Senate by Senator Helms, which would provide in a bill, not a constitutional amendment, that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, and which would deny to federal courts the right to act in cases attacking abortion laws.
I don't remember the latter, but go ahead.
Well, that's part of the bill which you said you were in favor of, which is now pending at the introduction of Senator Helms. Since then, Senator Hatch, who is the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has said publicly that he believes that such a statute as I just described would be unconstitutional, since it is directly inconsistent with Supreme Court decisions on the subject, and therefore he has introduced an alternative measure. His alternative measure would be a constitutional amendment, and it would provide that abortion is not a matter of constitutional protection and that both the states and the federal government shall have the right to restrict or prohibit abortion, and if the states conflict with the federal government, then the more restrictive shall apply. That is the legislative situation in the Congress as of this moment. As against that, I would like to ask you a series of questions. One...
Let's start with one, okay?
All right.
Okay.
The Helms bill could be passed by a simple majority. The Hatch bill would require a 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House, since it is a constitutional amendment. In view of the fact that Senator Hatch and other leading Republican senators have stated that the Helms bill is, in their opinion, clearly unconstitutional on both grounds, namely the fetus, a person from the moment of conception, and the federal courts being denied jurisdiction. Do you now feel that the Helms bill should be passed by a simple plurality vote in Congress? I should add that 5 ex-attorney generals, 7 leading professors of constitutional law, and a great many bar associations and so forth have all taken the position that both parts of Senator Helms' bill are unconstitutional.
Well, let me try to answer that simple question by making a couple of relevant observations. The first being that if you're going to take the position that no Congress should pass a decision that runs counter to an elaboration of the Constitution by the Supreme Court, you would logically be required to say, now should the Supreme Court do this? In which case, well, Brown versus Board of Education was unconstitutional because it denied Ferguson. The Supreme Court is constantly engaged in contradicting itself. So the question arises, at what point does it become relevant for Congress to contradict the Supreme Court? We have specified means of doing so, including the removal of jurisdiction, specified precisely by the people who founded the Constitution of the United States. Now, you cite all these constitutional authorities who come out against the proposed piece of legislation, but you cite them for reasons quite understandable, a little bit incompletely. For instance, the reason Robert Bork is opposed to that particular bill is because he says it seeks itself, by bizarre means, to contradict an utterly bizarre and inexplicable ruling of the Supreme Court. If I were to say to you, Mrs. Pilpel, I am an alchemist. Here is a piece of lead. I shall proceed to turn it into gold. And then I ask you to pass a legislation repristinating that gold into lead, and you say, but how can I possibly do that on the grounds that it's lead to begin with? Then you face in some way the dilemma that faced by Mr. Bork. He says the Supreme Court had no right to rule as it did in Roe versus Wade, and I disapprove of Congress under the circumstances accepting an explicit invitation by the people who passed that decision to find human life. But if that invitation was legally tendered, and we are all being ruled by Roe v. Wade, then if it's legally tendered, then I see no active irresponsibility in Congress refusing to accept such responsibilities as were visited on it.
Well, that's a very complicated way of saying what I think is a very simple
that's a very complicated
proposition. We have something called the balance of powers, division of powers in this country.
No, we don't really.
Well, we have a constitution which divides government power into judicial, legislative. Well, that's your opinion. That's not the opinion of a great many other people.
Bork's opinion, for instance, you cited him as constitutional authority moment.
I didn't cite him. I cited a number of attorney generals.
Well, you just said that Congress could withdraw jurisdiction from the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court, not as you imply, doesn't have plenary authority.
Oh, no, it'll be up because people go crazy at the mere suggestion that they remove the funds. Like you go nuts if they pass a law removing.
There is a method in the Constitution which has lasted and served well for almost 200 years. No, the method is a constitutional amendment. If you don't like what the Supreme Court says, well, of course they've been made. There have been 26 constitutional amendments.
The 16th Amendment, no, to defy the Supreme Court. It's been used only once.
Not to defy the Supreme Court. The Constitution contains its own safeguard against the Supreme Court, which is a constitutional amendment.
Now, everybody knows that the Congress and the people and the states can change the Constitution anytime they want to. We're talking about a balance of powers, i.e., what do you do when the Supreme Court, as Moynihan puts it, is wrong? What do you do when the Supreme Court is wrong?
If you think the Supreme Court is wrong,
I say what you do is nothing. You say
no,
because you like the error into which they fell.
No, what I say is that we have a good instrument of government called the Constitution of the United States, which provides.
Provided is never used.
It's used all the time. We've had 26.
Been used once to contradict the Supreme Court.
I think actually it's been used 3 times to change the Supreme Court decisions.
What are the other 2?
But I haven't got them right to hand. But I would like to point out that we have had 26 amendments, and that Senator Hatch, who presumably is a person with whom you agree in many things, has taken the position that to try to obviate a Supreme Court decision by an act of Congress is a clearly unconstitutional, and if you'll pardon the expression, un-American method under our system of government.
Well, I think that's sheer nonsense, especially when the Supreme Court itself said if anybody had decided whether or not a fetus is a human being, clearly it would fall subject to the rights guaranteed by the 5th and the 14th
No, that is not what he said.
So who's supposed to decide? You, me,
that's a
Congress?
misquotation. The Supreme Court said just the opposite. What the Supreme Court said is when philosophers, religionists, physicians, lawyers have been unable to agree as to when life begins,
they don't agree on anything.
It is not up to an agent.
What do they agree on?
It is not. Well,
do they agree the Constitution is the best thing ever happened? Not necessarily.
We are talking now of something which is not susceptible of proof, but is a matter of religious belief.
They might agree that the sun will come tomorrow, but I can find out somebody who considers that problematic.
But the fact is that whether or not a fetus is a human being is not a
The fact is, we
scientific
are governed by political
statement.
decisions, and that which it becomes civilly relevant to decide upon has to be decided by the people.
Well, and
If you believe in self-rule, which I do.
I believe in self-rule. Somewhere between 75 and 80% of the people in virtually every poll taken have indicated that they do not support a ban on abortion,
Well, how
and
come,
that
how
is
come
being
50
ignored.
states had anti-abortion laws?
They didn't.
Yes, they did.
At one time in their history they did, but at the time of the United States Supreme Court decision, there were 18 or 19 states which had very liberal and permissive laws. The trend was clearly in that direction. All of those laws had been passed within the preceding 4 years. Had that development continued, it's fairly clear that it would have been more
popular
states.
referendum before the Supreme Court's decision had a 2 out of 3 vote against permissive abortion.
Well, I don't know the poll to which you're referring,
North
because
Dakota.
every referendum which has taken place since has been to the contrary, including at the time of the Supreme Court.
Look, if you said stealing was legal, you
You're
had
the
80%
one who
of people
said that
saying they're in favor of stealing.
Well, are you now not in favor of democracy? A few minutes ago you were all in favor of democracy and the people. Apparently you've changed your mind.
I say that political decisions have to be made by Congress, which
This
is
is not a
representative of the
political
people.
decision. This is a legal decision.
Well, I think we're repeating ourselves.
We were talking about a balance of power a minute ago. When you've got 3 branches of government and one of them can only be countermanded by a constitutional amendment,
Joe
you
Sobran.
don't have a balance of power.
Well, you're attacking the Constitution. I mean, that's your right under the Constitution to attack it. But what you're really saying is that the system devised by the Founding Fathers
Tell me
was
what I'm
not
really
a very
saying.
good one. Well, that is what you're saying.
Well, let me reinterpret my remarks in my own way, if I may. The Congress has the obligation to uphold the Constitution, too. If the court acts unconstitutionally, it should take some sort of action. Removal of jurisdiction seems to me to be the reasonable one and the prescribed one. I'd like to suggest a somewhat different approach to the abortion question without necessarily settling the philosophical question whether the human fetus is a human being.
This is sort of a question, right?
Yes, John Noonan has written an article recently on pain in the unborn, and he proposes a sort of humane slaughter act, or by implication, to take care of the suffering that is caused by abortion, which is an empirical, not a philosophical matter. Do you support that approach?
Yes, I do. In other words, we should be at least as concerned about pain in fetus as we are pain in cows.
Yes, even if you say they're not fully human, then they're at least partially.
Neither John Noonan or anyone else is able to prove what fetuses feel, because no one has ever been able to talk to a fetus. So that is his
You can't talk to a
deduction.
cow either.
But you can see that...
Maybe you can. Somebody got it.
I haven't tried. I would like to respond to something that you said, and then ask Bill about it. The proposal in Senator Helms's bill is not to deprive the United States Supreme Court of jurisdiction, which not even, I think, Senator Helms has ever thought of doing. But it is to deprive the lower federal courts of jurisdiction. Similar proposals have been made in connection with busing and prayer in the schools. In other words, these...
And labor injunctions and so on.
Well, yeah, the 3 at the moment I think that are most active are the ones I said, busing, prayer in the schools, and abortion. But there are a number of others. This represents an effort, which thus far has always been defeated, to overcome a rule of law which certain congressmen or senators don't like, by taking jurisdiction away from the courts. That was not within the contemplation of the judiciary
in the matter of labor
provision.
union injunctions. Under Roosevelt, the Supreme Court, the courts would deny jurisdiction over injunctions.
They were denied only the right to issue injunctions in labor disputes.
That's right.
But that was not taking away their jurisdiction. That was denying them one particular remedy.
Why did they bother to do it?
Because they did not want labor unions impeded by court injunctions.
But if the courts didn't have jurisdiction, why did they bother to take it away from them?
Oh, I didn't say the court didn't have jurisdiction. The court had jurisdiction of other matters, but they were not permitted to enter injunctions, which had been used as a strike-breaking vehicle. At least that was the perception at the time.
I think probably for the sake of form, we'd better remember how this is supposed to go.
Did you want to continue, Joseph, or you're done?
Go ahead.
I'll move off the point of abortion.